So, let's talk about offense and being offended. My name is Paul, and I'm an Oxford qualified psychologist who teaches people how to learn more easily and live more fully. I'm offended. It's one of those phrases that can either sound like a meaningful moral signal or like you've just taken personal umbrage at a slightly under-toasted bagel. And the problem is, those two things are not the same. But we often use exactly the same language for both. So I'd like to sharpen that language. Because quite often when people say, I'm offended, what they actually mean is something closer to that caused harm, or at the very least, that contributes to harm. Now, interestingly, that idea isn't just a modern reinterpretation. It's actually embedded in the history of the word itself. The English word offence comes via Old French offence, from the Latin offendere, meaning to strike against, to hit, or to cause injury. You can think when we say, I'm going on the offensive, it's not so neutral. So you see, originally, this wasn't about being mildly annoyed or precious. It was about impact, about something that knocks you off course, something that does damage, psychological, social, even existential. And I think we've drifted away from that because offense has become diluted, vague. It's a bit easy to mock, which is why when someone says, I'm offended, listeners often hear, I'm fragile. Whereas what may actually be meant is, this has consequences, and what is happening is wrong. Now, let's make that concrete. In 2018, Roseanne Barr posted a tweet about Valérie Jarrett that drew on a racist trope comparing black people to apes. Some defenders framed the backlash as people being offended by a joke. But that framing is wildly inadequate, because the issue wasn't simply that someone's feelings were a bit bruised. That kind of comparison has a long history tied to dehumanization, used to justify exclusion, discrimination, and literal physical violence. So when people reacted, what they were often pointing to is not just emotional discomfort, but the reinforcement of a pattern that has real, measurable consequences. Consequences in which black people continue to be overlooked for employment, for which they're more than qualified. They're over-targeted by law enforcement, despite being innocent, and discriminated against in such a way that literally endangers and harms them. It's not just bruised feelings, that's pretty bad anyway, but it's bruised bones, lives, and our societies. In other words, people should have perhaps replied to Roseanne's tweet by saying, not, this offends me, but rather, this contributes to harm. Ultimately, there was such an outcry that her show was cancelled. And I would say that's not just a response to mild irritation. That is a response to perceived social harm. Now, here's where psychology helps us get even more precise, because even using the word harm is still quite broad. Well, what kind of harm? What exactly is being experienced? And I think this is where the work of people including Brené Brown and Susan David becomes incredibly useful. I really rate both of them so much. Both emphasize, in slightly different ways, the importance of accurately labeling our emotions. Brené Brown talks about what she calls emotional granularity, the ability to distinguish between subtly different emotional states rather than lumping them together. And Susan David, in her work on emotional agility, makes a similar point, that the more precisely we can name what we're feeling, the more effectively we can respond to it. Or, put more bluntly, if your emotional vocabulary is vague, your thinking will be vague, your communication will be vague, and your ability to change things is unfortunately going to be limited. So, when we say, I'm offended, we're often doing exactly that. We're using a kind of catch-all label that obscures what's actually going on internally, because offense might contain several more specific experiences. Hurt, yes, but also sadness, anger, shame, a sense of being devalued, a sense of being unwelcome, very likely a feeling of powerlessness. And those are not the same things. So compare these two statements. I'm offended by what you said versus I feel devalued, sad, and powerless when you refer to my group as apes, because it reinforces a pattern where people like me are taken less seriously and thereby are made less likely to have as fulfilled a life as we reasonably could expect. Now, look, the second one is longer. It's a lot less convenient for Twitter. But psychologically, it's definitely more precise. It tells you what the emotional experience actually is. It tells you why it matters. And it translates that reaction into the actual impact on the individual. And I think that's much harder to dismiss because offense can be caricatured. Oh, you're offended. How unfortunate, you poor darling snowflake. But I feel devalued, and it affects how I'm treated in the world, is a much different kind of claim. It's heavier. It invites engagement rather than just casual eye-rolling. There's also links back to Claude Steele's work on stereotype threat. If certain kinds of language signals that your group is less competent, less worthy, or less legitimate, that doesn't just sting, it can actually impair performance, increase anxiety, and alter behavior. So the internal experience, feeling devalued or diminished, is not just subjective, it has functional consequences. Just imagine a mistake that you make, and we all make mistakes pretty much every day of our lives, being seen as confirmation that your whole group, be that gender, race, nationality, religion, is incompetent. That's a very heavy weight to carry. Yet it's a weight that many people carry in decent part due to offensive, read harmful things being said casually. I believe that saying that's offensive or I'm offended usually loses explanatory power. And if we said things like, this will damage people, I think that's a bit more accurate. When we just say, I'm offended, we risk making something complex sound trivial. And there's also a relational dimension here. This brings in the work of John and Julie Gottman. They are brilliant psychologists and literally the top experts for divorce prediction, amongst other relationship topics. So if you're wondering, well, is this the way the marriage is heading? The Gottman's work can sort of be illustrative. Anywho, they would say that in environments where negative signals accumulate, so just the snide comments that you make to a partner or to a friend, and in this case to groups, people become more sensitive to cues, not because they're inherently fragile, but because they've learned through experience that those cues are significant. So when the partner suddenly says, oh, you sure you want to eat that? And it exists within the context of them moaning about your weight, it does mean something else. So again, what looks like taking offense may actually be a rational response to context and a personal understanding based on one's own phenomenology of the harm that is actually being caused. I'd suggest that this cuts two ways. If you're the one feeling offended, there's a responsibility to try, where possible, to unpack that, to ask yourself, what am I actually feeling? Is it hurt? Is it exclusion? Is it anger? Is it fear about longer-term consequences? Because the clearer you are, the more effectively you can communicate and hopefully change outcomes. And if you're on the receiving end, there's a responsibility not to immediately default to the least charitable interpretation. Instead of hearing offense and assuming fragility, you might ask, well, what's underneath them saying that? What's the actual impact that's being described? Because very often there is an impact. So, to bring this together, historically, offense meant something closer to harm, to being struck, to being knocked off course. Psychologically, it often contains a cluster of more precise emotional experiences: hurt, sadness, devaluation, powerlessness, and socially, it can point to patterns that have real consequences. But when we label all of that simply as offence, we flatten it. We make it easier to dismiss. We turn something potentially meaningful into something that sounds a bit trivial. So the upgrade is simple, but not easy. Say what you actually mean. Not just "I'm offended," but "this is the effect that this has had on me and others, and here's why this matters." Better labels, better thinking. Better thinking, better conversations. Better conversations, better mutual understanding. And better mutual understanding, hopefully, better consequences for us as a whole. And, as always, if you did find any of these ideas useful, well, perhaps give a follow. Bye-bye. Bye-bye now.